Hello, my sisters in Christ. This is Deborah with Women of the Word. Today we're going to look at the subject matter of the torn cloth. We're going to take a look at what the torn cloth symbolizes, what it represents in life. The torn cloth represents being in a place in your life where you're torn between what life has handed you and what God has promised you. Oftentimes, this is where the enemy tries to convince you to throw in the towel. Now, as I began to think about the torn cloth or a piece of torn cloth, I thought about the pressure that had to be applied to the fibers of the cloth in a certain area to cause it to lose its strength in that area and to begin to separate itself from the rest of the garment. That reminded me of the pressures of life. You know, the pressures of life that oftentimes cause a weakness in that area of our life, which in turn causes us to begin to lose faith in God or question God's plan for our life. Those pressures begin to tear at the very fiber that holds our faith in place and pulls us away from a loving and faithful God. Now, one of the pressures that Satan is just famous for using, one of the pressures that he constantly uses because it constantly works, is our past. The enemy is very deliberate with his attacks. He watches us closely and applies pressure to our weak spots. He applies that pressure because he knows when he applies pressure to our weak spot, it begins to initiate a tear. The pressure could come in the form of constantly reminding you of your past or constantly reminding you of who you were in your past. This tactic has a purpose. That purpose is to prevent you from ever fully realizing God's plan for your life. He uses past hurts, past pains, past bad decisions, memories of past sin, and your guilt. He uses those things and causes you to build a self-imposed mental prison. He knows that that mental prison will prevent you from living in the fullness of God's gift of forgiveness. He knows that that mental prison will prevent you from stepping out of the guilt and into the pardon that we all received at Calvary when we accepted Jesus Christ in our life. You know, that pardon that Jesus paid for in full at Calvary. Now, the enemy uses our past to keep us at a crossroads between what life has handed us and what God has promised us. Now, one of the things that Satan uses, one of his main tactics, is found in the life of Joseph in Genesis. The pit. God made Joseph a promise of rulership in Joseph's dreams. The enemy used the jealousy of his brothers to put pressure on the fiber of Joseph's life in an attempt to separate Joseph from the promise that God had given him in his dreams. He wanted to prevent Joseph from fully experiencing God's promises. He wanted to prevent Joseph from fully realizing the promise of God. Joseph found himself in a pit that seemed far away from God's promise for his life. I want you to know, my sisters, the enemy still uses the pit tactic to imprison the people of God today. Oftentimes, we find ourselves fretting over life's challenges, our failures, our problems, our shortcomings, and just the pressure of life in general. We find ourselves fretting over those things or those areas in our life, and that begins the tear. That's when we find ourselves in a pit of depression, of sadness, of gloom. We fall into a dark place and begin to lose hope. If you've never experienced a pitfall in your life, you live a little longer. Life has a way of handing you challenges that tug at the fiber of your being. It tugs and it tugs until the very fiber that holds the strength of your faith begins to tear and weaken. I remember when the enemy had me imprisoned in my shame and guilt. He had imprisoned me in the shame and guilt of a failed marriage. Now, I was torn between the dreams of a fairy tale life that had a perfect family unit and the reality of being a single parent with no idea how to handle the pain and the shame of what the enemy had convinced me was totally my fault. Now, unlike Joseph, who had been tossed into the pit by his jealous siblings, I jumped into my own pit by my own doing, my own choices, my own wrong turns in life, my failures. But I'm blessed to report today with great authority that no matter why you find yourself in the pit, the same God that delivered Joseph from the pit can deliver you from your place of darkness. You see, when Joseph was in that pit, I'm sure it looked like certain death. But Romans 8:28 comes into play here. And it says, and we know that all things work together for good of those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. You see, no matter what the enemy uses to get us to the crossroad of being torn between what life is handed and what God has promised, you have to be of the mindset that it will all work together with something else that God has placed in your life and be for the good. God used what Joseph's brothers had meant for harm as a catalyst to position Joseph exactly where he needed to be to fulfill his promise to Joseph. You see, Joseph's stay in that pit, it was actually his ticket to Egypt. God uses all aspects of the pressure and pain in our lives, of the things that tear at the very fiber of who we are. He uses all aspects of those challenges for the good. Now, I didn't say they are all good. I didn't say that they all feel good. But every challenge we go through, God uses it for the good. Now, while God used Joseph being sold into slavery as his ticket to Egypt, God also used his deliverance out of the pit to develop an unshakable bond and trust between himself and Joseph. And that bond and that trust took Joseph through many other trials and setbacks before he fully realized the promise of God. You see, God took what I know had to be pain and sorrow that Joseph felt by being betrayed by his brothers and developed Joseph into a compassionate man who had a love for people even when they didn't treat him right, even when they didn't return that same compassion and love. I believe that people who are betrayed have two choices. You can either turn into a betrayer yourself, or you can allow God to heal you so that you can rise above that experience, rise above that betrayal, rise above that pain, and allow God to show you the fullness of his promise for your life. It took me years to fully understand and allow God to heal me. You see, I merely walked around in my pit pretending that the pain had miraculously vanished. The enemy fools you into believing that your lack of tears indicates that you've risen up out of the pit, when in actuality, you're just walking around in circles like the Israelites. Just because a wound stops bleeding does not mean it's been healed. Just because you aren't crying daily over your situation doesn't mean that you've been healed from the pain and the disappointment of your situation. It simply means that it's been buried beneath the surface. It means that you've mastered the art of pain management. I'm here to tell you, the master is able to heal the pain completely. Don't waste your time learning the art of pain management. Allow God to get rid of the pain. Don't be tricked into living with unnecessary spiritual pain. Once I acknowledged to God that I was ashamed, once I acknowledged to God what I was ashamed to acknowledge to my family and friends, I received my true healing. As I gave God my hurt, my burden became a little lighter. So then I gave him my anger, and guess what? My burden became lighter still. Next, my feelings of mistrust, and oh God, I could see spiritual freedom right on the horizon. So I gave him my shame and my guilt and my life. Now, this is the most important part of sacrificing or giving over to God. Most of the time, we try to save our life as being the last thing that we give to God, when in actuality, it should be the first. A lot of times we get that wrong. You see, when you give all of your burdens to God, but not yourself, which is the burden carrier, your burdens merely manifest themselves in a different situation down the road. You have to come to a place where you totally give yourself to Jesus Christ as a living sacrifice. Romans 12:1 says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." You see, once you present yourself as a living sacrifice, you move past the crossroads of being torn between what life has handed you and what God has promised you, and your faith is strengthened. Your faith then reminds you that God is a faithful God. He can't lie. This realization allows you to rise above the pain, not walk in it. Rise above the shame, not hide from it. Rise above the hurt, not cover it up. Rise above the anger and not be consumed by it. You see, once you give yourself as a living sacrifice, you gain the understanding that things don't always feel good, but they always work together for good. Offering yourself as a living sacrifice pulls you out of the pit and gives you access to true worship. You know, that worship that springs forth before even the dark clouds have a chance to dissipate. That worship that is designed to confuse the enemy because it bubbles up out of you even before your situation passes. That worship is a result of who you serve, not who you are or where you are in your journey. I encourage you, my sisters, rise up. Allow God to refresh, restore, and renew your life. Allow him to mend the tear that the pressures of life have placed in the very fibers of your being. My challenge to you is, rise up, my sisters. Rise up.